I would like to invite Dr. McGregor to remain on stage for the question and answer session. At the same time, I would like to invite Dr. Chung, Dr. Alan Chung, to join him on stage to moderate the session. Dr. Chung, please. We are now ready to commence the afternoon's question and answer session. It was a very interesting sharing. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hands. We have our colleagues here who will be carrying the mics around, and please remember to also introduce yourself and the organization that you're from. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you very much. I thought that we would talk for about half an hour to 40 minutes and then adjourn for refreshments and for our own side conversations, if you like. I thought I would ask a couple of questions just to get things started, because I think it's a very interesting and provocative point of view you put across. That's very important. And I thought I would quote from another museum director who shall go nameless, but is director of a large institution in California. You probably know where I'm going. But I thought I would throw this out because you talk about the importance of a universal museum, of an encyclopedic museum open to everyone. And I think what's particularly striking to me is that the objects that you have in your museum, you've emphasized the fact that it's a shared ownership, that this belongs to everyone, to all cultures, to all peoples, not just to the founding civilization or culture, as it were. But there is a contrary view to this, and this museum director asserted that a universal or encyclopedic museum by definition involves colonialism and imperialism. That by definition trying to possess things from other cultures, especially if you're expansive and want to, in a sense, possess the world, has at least a very negative connotation involving power, exploitation, and issues like that. And I'm not subscribing to this belief, let me emphasize, but I thought we might start the ball rolling by considering this. There's a negative side to world trade and to embracing the world, isn't there?
There is. And I think this is, I think, one of the real challenges for any museum and for any attempt really to understand the world through things. If I can just go back one, why I think it is very important to use things in this way is that if you don't focus on things, then you immediately exclude all cultures and societies that don't have writing, if we stick to texts. And that means we exclude most people from most of history. So if we really are hoping to look at the world, it has to be things. But also, the kind of information you can get from things, watching patterns move across space, across time, that information is very deep and very rich, better, I think, than for texts, which are tied to one place. Things go on living beyond the time they were made, and things can travel and be understood by people who will never understand a text. So they are much more universal than texts, because language excludes, obviously, as we all know. So that's why the question of how you have things to look at and compare is important. Of course, there's no doubt that all the great encyclopedic collections have been enriched by the exercise of unbalanced power, whether that was directly military or economic, or simply the capacities to move around. That's clearly true. There's also, as we all know, a great deal of exchange of goods, which has nothing to do with that at all. One of the things we start doing very, very quickly is trading. And very fascinatingly, one of the first object found by Captain Cook in Australia, a shield dropped by an Aboriginal, turns out on close examination to have come from several hundred miles away from where it was dropped. It must have been exchanged, traded, whatever. We know that trading, as well as raiding, is something that all people do. So I think I would say, of course, that is an element in putting together a collection of this sort. I think what that leads on to is, does the fact of a colonial and imperial past with its dark side and in the making of the collection, what special obligations does that put on you now in the using of the collection, would be my response to that. And I think it's a perfectly proper starting point, if you like. But the question, I think, is then, how do you use the objects which allow this overview to enable everybody to have it?
Do you subscribe to the idea that now is being put forward, that rather than all objects having to return to their culture of origin, that there is great value in seeing other things in different places? This whole idea of tolerance and understanding being underscored by the circulation of visual images and by real objects of various sorts in museums.
Well, you know I'm going to say yes. But one of the reasons I would say yes so convincingly is because people move around, particularly now, and we don't want to send people back. It's a given now that if I talk only about my own city in London, and it's something like only something like 30% of the people now living in central London were born in the UK. We live in a world where people move around, where people want to find, I think, their own histories in local museums. But also, because of that, if the people are going to move, then I think the things have got to move.
That was a brief introduction, but I hope we can have questions or comments from the audience. Is there a microphone that will go around? Ah, yeah, wonderful. Otherwise, I have to go through my boring list of questions here, so it's more exciting to hear. Shall I call on people? Oh, there's one.
I'd like to shift a bit and talk about your wonderful podcast series, History of the World Through 100 Objects. Could you talk a little bit about the background of that and how it's a way of really sort of expanding the purview, I mean, it's not the scope of how the museum interacts with the world?
Thank you. The idea came really from the kind of questions that Alan has just asked. In what way does this collection, which was put together for the 18th century, in what way can that now be used? And what became very clear was that because objects have their own biographies, which involve so many different people in different places, that the story of the object will take you through time and always establish connections and remind one of our connectedness. The real excitement was, first, the BBC decided, we'd done a few little projects, they wanted to do this huge project of 100 and the whole world from the beginning to now. And that then led to some very exciting conversations in the museum, because we said we'd do it by time, that we'd spin the globe at various moments and take objects from all around the world. Because they wanted to broadcast one program every day of the week, Monday to Friday, it meant that the whole of human experience had to be divided into 20 chunks of 5. So 5 objects that would tell you what the world was thinking about in 2000 BC. Now, it's not the way most curators approach their objects. And the conversations were very fascinating. If we have an object about the power of the pharaoh from Egypt, what can we bring from China to show how the emperor organized his power? What can we bring from Mexico, whatever? How do people exercise power? Those kind of debates were very interesting. What became very clear is that really we make things always to express a view of how we fit into the people around us. And that if we explored that, we got a different reading of the objects. The second point was that it answered one of the other aspects of Alan's question. Because radio allows you to bring in different voices, it meant that for almost every object that we chose, we could ask for a voice from the source country to talk about what it meant to them. Both what it meant to them in terms of their own history, but also what it meant to them to have it now in the British Museum, whether they were comfortable with that, whether they saw it as a way of presenting their culture or whatever. So I think if you take the single object, it's much, rather perversely, it's much easier to have different voices around the one object than a different kind of history.
Did you work out the selection closely with your curators and as well as the selection of these other voices?
Yes, that was really the planning, the long planning. And the great fun was what were we going to include, what was not to be included.
Ambassador.
George Takeuchi, Ambassador of Japan here. Thank you for an excellent talk. And thank you for keeping Japanese gallery at the British Museum. It's very good.
That's relief. That's a great relief.
Now, two questions. Well, both related to your reference to the destruction of cultural heritage as we witness every day. First, if my memory is correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have been involved personally to the restoration of the vandalism which happened at the wake of the Iraqi war. Could you share with us a little bit how it happened? What was your involvement there? And two, how can we continue to demonstrate the resilience of culture? I think you have already mentioned in your speech about this aspect a little bit. Could you further elaborate on this topic as well? Thank you.
Thank you. The first part of the question, the Iraq War of 2003, it was one of the great demonstrations of what exists in the museum world, which I'm sure the Cultural Academy is going to develop even further, is an extraordinary international community of inquiry and of cooperation. It's a very odd kind of community because there's very, very little competition. Apart from the rare moment when we're competing for a particular object to acquire or a particular sponsor, and Alan always wins those competitions, there is real shared interest and shared aim. And that means that over decades, close friendships build up. The British Museum had actually set up the museum in Baghdad in 1921. So the links with our colleagues in Baghdad were very, very close. And I mean, this is one of the, I think, happy outcomes of imperial history, is that the museums in the country which was set up all still use the same card index systems. So we can all find each other's material very easily. But there were very close connections. And we were all, of course, we were all watchful about the invasion of Iraq. We had all alerted the government, both in the US and in the UK, of the danger to sites in particular, particularly if there were bombing. But we'd focused very much on the sites. What happened was quite literally a telephone call to my office from the director of the museum in Baghdad saying the museum is being looted and there's nobody to protect us. Quite simply a colleague to a colleague. And he didn't know what else to do. And I then phoned the Prime Minister's office in Downing Street and passed on that message saying the museum was being looted and there was nobody to protect. And at that stage, some protection was put in. And we then worked afterwards with the colleagues in Iraq to help recover the objects, but also to help document the damage to the sites. And that was a very successful international cooperation with many, many colleagues from many, many countries. What is tragic about the current situation is that our colleagues in Iraq and Syria have asked us to be very prudent in our declarations. And there is nothing, of course, we can do on the ground because nobody can be sent. But the real danger is, of course, there's a huge danger to the objects, but the staff in the museums and on the sites are also targets and have been headed, as you know, both in Iraq and in Syria. And there's a great risk if we make too much in public terms of drawing attention to them and putting them at danger. So on the advice of our colleagues in Iraq and Syria, the museums internationally with large archaeological collections and connections are being relatively silent compared with 12 years ago. What we're preparing is whether we can cooperate with those colleagues so that after this settles, we can work together on recovery programs. That's what we're focusing on. But it's a new level. Nobody in 2003 was deliberately targeting the people in the institutions. That is what has changed very dramatically. Then it was about looting for profit. Now, clearly, it's about destruction as symbolic warfare. So it's the two situations are quite strikingly different.
The British Museum is still involved in institution formation, especially in the Middle East. And I'm curious if you'd comment about your the advisory role, quite strong advisory role being played in Abu Dhabi, and not really the practicalities of that museum cooperation, but what are the broad goals that you think your British Museum's involvement is going to reinforce in the region?
What we've been invited to do by the government of Abu Dhabi, by the Crown Prince, was to work with colleagues there in the establishing of a national museum to tell the story of Abu Dhabi. It's why we've been so interested in the reshaping of the National Museum here. I mean, how the story of a state is presented, and particularly where the recent history is such an important part of that narrative, and what kind of material is told. The situations of the two city-states, if you like, Abu Dhabi and Singapore, are in some ways comparable. That Abu Dhabi is also a very long-standing trading post with connections both from India to the Middle East.
And multi-ethnic at a certain stage.
Yes, and also multi-faith communities now, which they're seeking to integrate. So our role is really to work with the colleagues, trying to establish how to choose objects that will tell certain kinds of stories and to present the narratives. And it's a very, very fascinating one to be engaged in.
Another question then. Gentleman there, yep.
There's one in the front row.
Thank you. Philip Green, High Commissioner of Australia. Thank you, Dr McGrath, for a very insightful talk. I've got two questions, one which flows a little from what you were just talking about. Singapore is a multiracial society. We in Australia describe ourselves characteristically as a multicultural society. Many of the objects that you showed, not all of them, but many of them displayed some purity of culture, some specific culture. Many of the worlds that we live in now are not worlds of purity, they're worlds of intersection, of inflection, of interaction between peoples. How, as a curator, do you characterize those moments of inflection as well as the pure cultures? Second thing I was going to ask is, what in the future will people collect from now? And in particular, how will people represent the digital world in which so many people now live, with its endless creation, much of it barely enduring for a moment or an instant? How will the curators of the future try to characterize our age?
Thank you. They're both extraordinarily important questions. We try to collect objects that will quite deliberately show different cultural influences at work, the merging of them, like the Filipino St. Joseph, like the Gandhara Buddha, of course, is a straightforward example. But we try to collect them particularly from the world now. And when we were trying to choose the last object for the history of the world, the 100th object, and this is where it's a great advantage not being an art museum. My colleagues were particularly keen to promote one object, which is a football shirt from Chelsea, worn by Drogba. Now, they thought this was the perfect object that would speak to the future of a totally globalized world in 2010. Drogba being from the Ivory Coast, but playing for an English club, Chelsea, which is, of course, owned by a Russian oligarch, Abramovich. And even better than that, they had not, of course, bought the official Chelsea shirt. They bought a fake Chelsea shirt which had been a knockoff, which had been made in China, and we bought it in Uruguay. And all this was documented. And we thought this was going to be the absolutely splendid object to show a really global world, as impossible before. Unfortunately, it became clear that if we did use it, Chelsea was likely to raise an action to us for showing. They then said they wouldn't, but that was a concern. But these kinds of objects are very, very fascinating to document and collect. And at high art, of course, all the way through, this can be done. Your second question about the digital is, of course, a nightmare. It's why I'm so glad to say that's the responsibility of the library. The British Library separated from the British Museum 20 years ago, and I'm delighted. They have to decide how you collect websites, and which state of which website you collect, and how you store it, and so on. And of course, there's no obligation of deposit for any of the material. It is a nightmare, which I'm sure is being addressed by people far cleverer, and I wish them well. But it is a huge, and of course the answer is it is almost impossible. It is almost the colossal volumes of material are being conserved, but all what would have been the postcards, the letters, don't exist and won't exist. Yes.
Monica Tomlin. I'm a fairly regular museum goer, and I enjoy often the wonderful special exhibitions that are shown. But I always think that even when you have hundreds of thousands of people who go to them, that in fact, in the context of your saying that we all share the same humanity, that there is a huge potential to reach out to a larger public. So my question is, and thinking about how classical music and opera have been democratized through digital means, what is the future that you see in such tools, let's say, to take these exhibitions to a much greater public?
Thank you. It is the key question, how are these collections now shared? I mean, that extraordinary 1753 Parliament idea that it was to be free to native and foreign is very important. Firstly, on the physical side, what has been transformed in the last 20, 30 years is the technology of travel. It is now possible for these collections to move, most of them, far more than before. And that is something we've got to use. So the first way of sharing the collections is simply they have to travel much, much more. I mean, obviously there's some things that aren't too fragile, but that has to be a real aim, that they move a lot. And I would also see in that the deliberate building of long-term loans from collections as deep and as rich as the British Museum. The British Museum at the moment has about 2 million of the objects are already online for study. So once an object has been published and is online, the physical location is less important. A scholar that needs to see the thing can travel anywhere to see it. But it does mean that the objects can really be shared with the world. Digitally, it's quite clear that making them available online, curating them online so that people can use them, write them, that is the big challenge. And we're all doing that more and more. The smartphone, of course, is changing everything, because we're all working towards a position where you go round the exhibition and you have on your own phone the information you want in the language you want, and it's there for you to take home. So I think we're on the threshold of a totally new level, both of physical sharing and of digital access.
May I just say that the British Museum has pioneered the way in high-res photographs being available freely and openly without charge to researchers and interested parties. This began about 7 years ago, I say, and it has really revolutionized scholarship and research in art, that I can download any German print I want from the print room.
I think this is a very important point. Your point. One of the difficult habits in the past has been that because museums are concerned about the financial possibility of using their imagery and licensing it, they've been very reluctant to release images digitally. Our trustees took the decision, as Alan said, about 7 years ago, that as the collection was held for all studious and curious persons, then if you really wanted them to be studious and curious, you had to make high-resolution digital imagery free for teaching. So we began with the Old Master Drawings collection. And this, of course, has revolutionized the study of drawings quite literally. You can now study a Rembrandt drawing in detail in Sydney with a class, far better than you could with a group of students in the British Museum, where they wouldn't be able to get that close, and where zooming in is dangerous. So the free access to higher resolution imagery is, I think, a very, very important part of this.
Neil, thank you very much for a really good talk, and on a topic that I fully concur with in terms, my name is Jay, I'm director of Changi Museum, and my museum focuses on shared history because of the war. We had 137,000 troops here in Singapore from many countries, India, Britain, Australia, pilots from New Zealand, and our own troops here. So my museum is always focused on a shared history. And in a country like Singapore, it is a global city. Well, evidenced by the fact that I'm probably the first Singaporean to ask you a question here today. Having said that, I constantly come across the strain that as a young nation, a decolonized nation, the focus should be on a Singaporean narrative and a Singaporean history, and that it's time to focus on local things rather than a global perspective. I just wanted your views on those, that strain of thought.
It's a very important question. It's obviously entirely, these are decisions to be made in each place, by each place, and I don't think it would be proper for me to comment on what decisions Singapore should make. What I can say is that in our own country, where the population has been transformed in the last 40 years, I think it's extremely important that we should not just focus on British history. Very, very important that we should remember that not just that it's the history of our other fellow British citizens of different origins, but that actually there is no history of Britain without the rest of the world. And I suspect that's true of Singapore as well. I mean, the history of Britain without the rest of the world would be a very short tale, and not a very interesting one. And I think that it is the rest of the world that has written our history with us. Whether they wanted to or not is a separate question. But that is what happened. And we've done it together. And we've got to keep remembering that and being with it. So I think from our point of view in London and in Britain, it's extremely important to refuse the single local story. I mean, it's obviously part of it, but it's actually quite a small part in Britain's case.
Such an interesting issue. I wonder if I could push you just a little bit further, because beyond historical narratives, which are nation-focused or local-focused, there's the role of the institution, whether it serves a local population, a regional one, or an international one, and something that I think that we all grapple here on a day-to-day basis, as well as the question of ownership. Do we possess objects? Are they ours? Do we hold them in trust for all of humanity, or is there a different way of looking at this? I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, I mean, clearly the fact that we are legally a trust owned by trustees with the beneficiaries, the whole world, does give us the ideal legal framework to say that we are holding it for everybody. The question is how do you make a reality of it? And two things that I think are important. There obviously, in many cases, there's a very bitterly contested history. And the recent example we tried to explore was the Australian one. The most recent exhibition we've had at the British Museum was an attempt to tell the story of Australia from the Aboriginal side, through the things. Of course, we were all brought up on the story when Australia was discovered and so on. And with the texts, a non-literate society for so long, the things have to be what tell the story. And we worked jointly with the National Museum of Canberra and their Aboriginal consultants and their community groups to present the things and the narratives from the Aboriginal point of view. It was an important thing for Britain as well, with this being a very, very black part of the imperial adventure. I mean, particularly in Tasmania, where one has to talk about a genocide. And to have that presented quite straightforwardly as factual history to the British public was also very important. The fascinating thing I found was that firstly, the huge interest in Britain to find out more about this other Australia, of which, of course, they knew something, but knew they didn't know enough. The engagement with the objects and the narratives, that was very encouraging. But the more surprising thing was that the Aboriginal advisors who came to London discovered something that was a huge surprise to them. We presented this collection as the oldest continuing human culture in the world. It is the only place where you have an unbroken record of habitation and cultural behavior over 30,000 years, probably nearer 50. And they were, not surprisingly, because so much of their focus had been asserting Aboriginal culture in the context of white Australia, to find that in the context of the whole world, Aboriginal Australia had a quite different role and a different meaning, was something that many of them commented on as something that was not only surprising, but very welcome. That's one area, and I think it's an important one for institutions like the museum, where it allows Britain to confront its own imperial histories, not told by itself, as well as allowing the Aboriginal communities to present their narrative in a global framework. The other moment where the museum, I think, did something remarkable because of the objects was when we presented a history of Sudan. We decided to put on an exhibition on the long history of Sudan in 2005, which was the centenary of the founding of the museum in Khartoum. And our colleagues wanted us to do this. At that stage, Sudan was in civil war. And what was extraordinary was the British Sudanese diaspora from both north and south and from Darfur were able to meet in the museum to discuss their history, their identity, in safe ground. And that role of the museum as being a safe place for these very, very difficult discussions, it's not clear where else those Sudanese exiles could have met and discussed. And I think it's one of the things create a framework of shared history, of shared inheritance that does allow a certain kind of discussion.
We spoke a little bit about this morning, the idea that museums exist a little bit outside the political world, a little bit outside government and the economic world, and is therefore has a kind of neutral role to play as a convener or as a meeting point. I wonder if you comment more about that, specifically based on the museums of Singapore that you've had a chance to see over the last couple of days and on your previous visits. Because I think many of the museum directors and practitioners here have struggled with this idea. How much can we talk about? How much can we facilitate and bring people together within the museum context?
Well, I've only, it's some years since I've been in Singapore, so the presentations of the Peranakan Museum or the National Museum are ones I've seen only yesterday and today. But what struck me in both cases was the enormous inclusiveness of the narrative and the courage in addressing issues like the emergency. I mean, that must be a nightmare for any museum professional. I mean, how do you tell a story where there are so many different views of the story, and yet you can't present a narrative of Singapore without reference to it? And I thought that was I found that very admirable. And I can imagine the conversations that have taken place and do take place. But it seems to me that once there is a narrative there, you have a different kind of framework for people to revisit the history, disagree with that narrative, talk about what's been omitted, or endorse it. And I think that those roles are very important. And given again, I've been constantly struck by the balance of the narrative that shows of the different constituent parts of the Singapore population, how all the strands are present as far as possible. And one can see a huge effort has been made to achieve that. And again, once it's there, it allows a different kind of debate. So I'm admiring and quite relieved I haven't had to make those judgments.
Well, maybe I'll conclude with a question that I've been kind of saving up. What's next for you, Neil? You have announced your retirement from the British Museum. You've done a fantastic job, and you're about ready to embark on a new adventure as the chairman of the Humboldt Forum, a wonderful new building in the middle of Old Berlin, which is going to be a new museum of world culture, I suppose. How will this be different from the British Museum? What can be achieved? Is the German/Berlin context so different from London/Britain that the museum will take on a different role? Give us a sneak preview of what you're going to be doing.
Well, to start at the end, I mean, the role of a museum of the world collections in Berlin, which are comparable to those in Paris and London, are of course entirely different because the history of Germany is so different. And Germany has an address to its history because of the terrible histories of the middle of the 20th century, which sets it apart from any other European country, and the courage with which they've confronted those terrible chapters. So the role of history in public life in Germany is of a different order and has a central place in the debate about how society should change for the future. I think it's very fascinating. The refugee crisis is a very good example. I mean, the fact that so much of the discussion in Britain or France about the immigrants coming from Africa and the Middle East, Britain and France's response has been quite simply, are politicians nervous about letting more immigrants in because it might not play well with the domestic audience? And that's almost the end of the debate. In Germany, a completely different kind of debate about the history, about Germany as a country that expelled people from which people had to be refugees and therefore has a different kind of moral responsibility. That is a very interesting difference between the two. And it means that the whole debate of how you look at the relations between Europe and the rest of the world has a different edge. And a different edge because so much less of the collection in Berlin was acquired directly through empire compared with Paris or London. So your starting off question is in a different place. But I think what I find interesting about it is that the rehousing of the global collections in the center of Berlin was a very deliberate statement by the German government that in what was the palace of the German emperors, there would now be the cultures from beyond Europe. And that this was a statement of how Germany wanted to engage the world, and that the conversation between Europe and the world should be rethought and reimagined. And how that's done, both in presentation but also in exchange of people, is the real challenge.
Well, shall I conclude? Any last comments or questions? Thank you very much. We wish you all the best in your new adventure. It sounds very exciting. And thank you very much for helping us launch the Culture Academy. this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for the active participation in this session. How about a round of applause again for Dr. McGregor and Dr. Chung for this interesting discussion. At this point, I would like to invite our guest of honor, Ms. Yo Chi Yen, to present a token of appreciation to Dr. McGregor. Ms. Yo, please. Thank you, Ms. Yeo, and thank you, Dr. McGregor. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of today's event. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you go back with new ideas from all the sharing. We would also like to extend our appreciation to the National Gallery Singapore for the kind sponsorship for the venue and all the logistics support. On this note, I would like to thank you and like to invite you to join us at the cocktail reception outside the auditorium. Thank you all once again and have a wonderful evening ahead.